Louloudes. Okay, so Ms. Louloudes is a teacher at a third grade teacher at Forest Knolls Elementary in Montgomery County, Maryland. She has multiple teacher certifications in elementary, special ed, and ESOL. She has taught for 9 years, or
correct?
Right?
Correct.
And in language arts and social studies, math and science, and is on the leadership board at her school, as well as serving as the equity team leader in the building. And she has recently both put together the lesson plans we're going to look at today and also has used them with her students, and they've been quite a success. So I will let you take it away.
Thank you. One thing that my bio does not necessarily address is my racial identity. And I think that's something that is important to note because we are talking about race. And I know as educators, race plays a huge factor in our comfort levels to discuss social issues, but also the way in which we guide our instruction. So I am actually biracial. My father was a very successful surgeon, thoracic surgeon, who was a light-skinned Black man before he passed away. My mother is a white woman. When they married in 1965, in which time it was against the law in the United States to marry of mixed race in all but 2 places, Washington, D.C. and in New York. I'm the youngest of 5 children, 2 to my parents, 3 to my father in his first marriage. And it's always been a topic of conversation in our family, the concept of race. My oldest brother is 20 years older than I am, and on his birth certificate, it actually has him listed as Negro. The next 3 siblings have their birth certificate marked as colored, and mine is the only certificate that says Black. If you were to see me, however, what you would see visually is a very, very pale white person in appearance. And so I bring that to your attention just because I do know when we are discussing race that many times people look at me and don't think that this is something that I would have background knowledge on, when in fact it's been a part of my entire life. So having said that, when my teammates and I devised these lessons, we devised them with the understanding that we were all coming from a different background. I have one coworker who is a white female. I have another coworker who is a gay white man. And so when you look at the parent letter, I think you'll see why I bring that to your attention. So Emily, if you can just pull up the parent letter.
Okay, working on it.
So while she's pulling that up, the thought process for us as educators was that we wanted to make sure that we were having a courageous conversation with our students, but we were also honoring our parents, knowing that we teach a very diverse group of people, that we wanted to make sure that the parents had an opportunity to join us in this lesson so they would hear directly what we were saying to them. However, the flip side of it was we did not want to give them that much detail prior to the lesson because we did not want anyone to opt out of it. So we teach using Google Classroom, and we also use Class Dojo to message our parents. And so the day before the lesson, we just sent a very simple invitation to the parents to say, we will be talking about current social issues. You are welcome to join us. And then after we did the lesson, we wrote a very detailed lesson message to the parents stating why we as a team decided to address the execution of George Floyd, on what actually we talked about. Then we gave them all the resources that we used and additional resources if they wanted to. Because like I said, this conversation is not necessarily comfortable from all aspects of it. And we want to make sure that we are as transparent as possible to our parents and to our families. So I do think that's something important to do if you're going to have conversations about race. And then Emily, if you would pull up the lesson itself.
Yep. Okay.
And while she's pulling this up, one of the conversations that we had, not necessarily within my team, but some educators felt like this was not an appropriate conversation to have with 8 and 9-year-olds. We heard feedback from people who felt like children should maintain their innocence. But that is not a privilege that all children in America have. And I think that that is an idea as educators that we have to push through and get through our discomfort, because there are many topics that are uncomfortable to us as an adult when we're talking to children, but you have to recognize that in your classroom, children are suffering and they're going through this. And if there's one kid in your class doing it, then all children in your class need to be educated to the problem. And that was a sticking point for our parents and really opened their eyes a lot. Our white parents were not necessarily thinking in those terms until we pointed out that our brown and black children, this is their life and their reality. They don't get to have an innocent childhood when it comes to wrongful deaths. So when we open our lesson, we always start with a idea for them to look at, just as everybody's coming into the Zoom meeting. And so this was our opening for them to kind of prep them for what we were going to talk about.
Okay, so I think it should be up. So if any...
It is. So if you want to click through the next slide, and then the next slide. So every time we post on Zoom, we try to keep our lessons very uniform so the kids are used to it. And we always go through what we're actually trying to achieve that day. So if you can go to the next slide. This is a great opportunity to ask your kids what they actually know. And I think it's important that educators and parents both realize that children know far more about what's going on in the world than we probably give them credit for. When we asked the students this, there were some parents who were visibly shaken by the amount of knowledge that the kids had. And the kids could tell us things like they knew that a black man had died because a policeman had stepped on his neck, was the way they phrased it. Somebody mentioned counterfeit. Somebody mentioned riots. And so they had bits and pieces of the story, but what they didn't have was it all put together. And I think that that is something that happens with our kids when they're walking past the news or hearing people talk on the phone. They're gathering parts of what's going on. And it is really our job to help them put that in order and to help them understand and process it. Emily, if you can go to the next slide, please. So the book that we chose to read to them is a book called Something Happened in Our Town. It is written by 2 psychiatrists, I believe, who felt like in the United States, there are so many wrongful deaths by police that a book needed to be made to help children process and understand it. And the dedication is just as to the families who've lost loved ones to racial injustice, and for those who are working for a future in which diversity is valued and celebrated. And so the book itself, and we don't have to listen to the book itself, but I can give you the synopsis of it. The book is about a police officer shooting a black male in their town, and it is told from the perspective of a white family and a black family. And in both cases, you get to see how those families are trying to teach their children to take actionable steps to change it. And what they talk about is disrupting the pattern and making a new pattern that, yes, these are things that have gone on. Yes, these things are still parts of our society that we need to fix. But as children, your jobs is to be conscious of it and try to break the patterns that we're seeing. And then the kids go to school and they have a new student from another country come in, and he is teased by somebody else, and both of the children step in and demand that this child can play soccer and makes friends with the child with the concept that they are breaking the pattern. So if you can go to the next. Yes. So then after we listened to the story, we asked the kids these discussion questions, just to make sure that we all had the same understanding about it. And this, again, was very painful to listen to the kids. A lot of our white students were like, I'm angry that people of my color would do something like this. My Black male students said that they would like to move to a different country because they were worried about something happening to them when they grew up. And so their pain and their connections to it was very relevant. They truly did grasp what we were discussing. So once we did that, we realized that we needed to make sure they had correct definition and vocabulary. If you can go to the next slide, Emily. So we then tried to think about all of the words that these kids are hearing and tried to clear up in the most non-biased way, giving them definitions of it. So we first started with trying to define what is the Black Lives Matter movement. We went to their webpage and pulled off their mission statement and simplified it for the kids to understand it, because we felt like that is such a controversial item in our country, trying to figure out and often misrepresented what actually the mission is of the Black Lives Movement. And then we went through various other discussions. Some of it was a review from our civil unit in the beginning of the school year. So Emily, if you can click to the next slide. Justice and injustice is something we have talked all year with the kids about, if something is just or not. And so they had an understanding of it within the classroom and in that type of environment, but we needed to expand their thinking to understand that this concept is affecting society as a whole, and that this is what the issue is the injustice to the Black community repeatedly by police officers or vigilantes. If you can click to the next slide. This, again, prejudice and bias, was conversations we had in the beginning with the kids, but we needed to make sure that they understood it, that this bias is also occurring currently right now in response to how the United States has handled this mistreatment, that we've had this ongoing bias. And then the next slide. we wanted to go through the difference between protests and demonstrations, and then even riots, because when you listen to the news, Emily, if you can click to the next slide. When you listen to the news today paints riots in a extremely negative light, and that also then leads to a judgment of Black people and their actions right now, which is not necessarily appropriate to be occurring. And so we wanted to make sure that the kids understood why a riot might happen and where it exactly happens, because there was also fear for the kids. They were worried it was going to happen in their community. And so we needed to be really clear on what this is and what occurs. If you can just go to the next slide. And then we wanted to show the different ways people do speak out. The next slides. And so these were elementary school kids in our area. And we wanted to make sure we showed them that kids do have that power. If you can go to the next slide. A peaceful protest. The next slide. Flint, Michigan, for those of you who have seen the news about how wonderfully supportive the police officers in Flint, Michigan were, how they marched with the protesters, and Flint, Michigan has been such a neglected area and controversial area when you are talking about Black Lives Matter. So we felt like it was important to show that specific point, that place. If you can go to the next slide. We also wanted to make sure that the kids understood that this wasn't just happening in the United States, that Black Lives Matter has gone global, and that this is now something that is being discussed worldwide. The next slide, Denmark. But we felt the need to also show them their own hometown. And so this is Germantown, Maryland, which is about 20 minutes away from our neighborhood, because the other balance of it is you don't want them to then to become fearful of all police. They needed to be able to see police in a positive light. Next slide, please. So then we continue the conversation about the images and how they made them feel. And again, the kids were very open, and you know, a lot of the kids understood that it's not all cops that are bad. So, you know, we felt like it was a positive outcome. Next slide, please. So this is how we always end our lesson, is we give them a recap, and then it links to the lesson plan itself, which if we were in class, we would have called it a honey-do list. But because we're online, we've been a little bit more formal. If you can click on that one. So this gives them their detailed steps on what they're supposed to do after this lesson.
Okay, so you're ready to go to the lesson plan? Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry, the link was in there at first, and then I wasn't sure where the Google Drive should go for all the folks that will potentially be looking at this later. So I sent it zipped, not linked. So that was my.
That's okay.
That was my thing.
So again, in distance learning, we tried to set it up to follow the same format every time for the kids and the parents that were supporting them. And so this engage, explore, explain, reflect was what we did every time. So their follow-up was to read another book called Let the Children March. And it is about the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, and the power that children have and the rights to let them march. And then they were to follow up with a written response, which was a 10-sentence response to a prompt question, which we'll look at. But the reflect was then if you have any questions or concerns about today's lesson. And those responses is what helped guide us to do a second lesson on this, because the kids had a lot of great feedback for us, and still a lot of questions, you know, some very basic on why would people do this, or why hasn't this been solved? I thought things were fixed with the civil rights movement, you know, and so there was just enough questions for them that we felt we needed to follow up. Emily, if you can just pull up the written prompt so we can take a quick look at that.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure what I'm sharing at this point, but here I will go to the written prompts. So if I stop sharing something I should be, just let me know, because sometimes I think it stops sharing when I mean to be sharing. Do you have the written prompts up?
I think it says written response is the file. And if you can't, we can just move to lesson 15 if we need to. There it is, current events, written response at the top.
There we go.
Okay, so right now in third grade, our expectation is 10 quality sentences. That was just a continuation of the expectations from when we were in school. So any journal prompt they have, that is what we're looking for. So their prompts were to reflect back on something happened in our town, and for the children to say how they could make a positive difference in their community, like Josh and Emma did when they disrupted the pattern. And then the others was, how did the recent events regarding the protests make you feel? What have you learned about equity, race, and its importance? The majority of the kids responded to prompt 2. The interesting thing was a lot of our kids felt the desire to protest, and so they actually, amazingly enough, put together a protest on the main street in front of our school. And that grew from third graders deciding that they wanted to take an actionable step. And they then had parents who organized it. And they, I think, have had 3 protest walks from one high school to the next high school on the main road. And for me, it's just incredible that that came out of this lesson, and the need and understanding of kids that to make changes requires action. So we got a lot of great response from this lesson. Our parents were very appreciative of it. But as I said, the kids had enough questions that we felt that the follow-up appropriate lesson would be to discuss race in general and what is race. So Emily, if you can pull up lesson 15.
Mm-hmm. Can you see it?
Yes. Okay. So again, we try to always give them a focus for the lesson. And this obviously was another great quote that we found that was relevant. If you can go 2 slides in, Emily. So we show the kids what they're going to do. We read a book called Let's Talk About Race, and then we had discussions and looked at their new reading assignment. Our opening questions for the kids is on the next slide. So we again reflected back on lesson 14 to just have the kids articulate the thoughts that they had written down, because lots of times that's a great icebreaker for the kids and helps them bring them back to the topic at hand. If you can go to the next slide. So this book is a great book about Julius Lester. Let's talk about race. And in this, he talks about writing your own story and how if we were to peel back our skin, we all actually look alike, that there is no difference beneath the skin, and that the color of your skin is only one part of your story, and that the religion you are, the gender you identify with, all of those things are parts of your story, and that you can't just read one section of a person's story. And so the kids really gained a great understanding about race and how, you know, the reality of it is it shouldn't be the focus when you're looking at an individual or talking to an individual. It really is only one component of a person. If you can click down 2 slides. So in the story begins with the moment you're born, and then builds the author's story from that point forward. He even talks about food that he likes and dislikes, favorite color, all of those things to just build who he actually is. Go to the next slide. So that led us to this quote that he says, just as I am a story and you are a story and countries tell stories about themselves, race is a story too. So we asked the kids, is race an important part of your story? And if so, why or why not? And why is the race story not true? What is the true story? And so the kids are really great about this, to be able to say, like, no, race is part of my story. It is something that I should be able to celebrate, but can't just look at me as a Black person or as a Latino person and see everything about me. And so they were able to decide the parts that were not true are the stereotypes, and the parts that were true is all the richness that different races bring to a community. If you can go to the next slide. One of the things the book talks about is that everybody is, at some point, thinks they are better than others. And what is the harm in doing that? Like, even on the most basic level, you think that, you know, girls can't play soccer, or you're the best at doing your multiplication tables. Like, when you have those thoughts, what are you saying about the rest of the people in the room? You're saying they're inferior to you. And so there has to be a balance. You're allowed to have good thoughts about yourself, but how can you do it in a way in which you're not making others inferior? And so that was a great conversation for them to have. And the book really sets it up well to give the kids language in order to be able to say, like, yes, I'm great at soccer, but so are other people. And just help them to make that difference, that slight adjustment in their narrative. You can go to the next slide. So we opened that to discussion. We reviewed the protests. Yep, you can keep going. Okay. And then this brought us to our lesson plan, which I don't know if you can open that or not, Emily, lesson 15. So this time they're going to read a book, a kid's book about racism, and not quite Snow White. And it is about a child who doesn't look like Snow White is supposed to look, and how everybody comes up with reasons why this kid cannot be Snow White. But it comes down to the color of the child's skin. And, you know, that just was being able to show those small microaggressions that are very much cemented into our society. And it really kind of exposes the thought that know Snow White is a character in a piece of literature who can look any way the director decides for Snow White to look. Snow White does not have to be a white female with the same hair color, that those are all social constructs. They're not actually part of the narrative. So their explain was for them to make their voice heard. This is where they then decided to make their own protests, but they were told that they could make a poster or a video or a piece of artwork, but whatever they wanted to do to make their voices heard. And the stuff these kids put together was just absolutely incredible. The creativity they had was amazing. Some of our kids took this as a photo essay in which they then found signs of Black Lives Matter and put that together to show their thoughts and feelings on it. Some kids made Google slideshows. One of my students who has a learning disability made a sign and posted it to her bicycle and rode around her neighborhood, actively protesting. So there was a lot of great responses from that. And then the reflection question, I can't actually read because I have something in my way. If you can scroll it up, there we go. We asked them then to define racism and make sure that they actually understood that term, so that, because it's such a tricky term, and especially when you are talking in a mixed race environment, kids are very funny about that term. Every year in the beginning of the year, I ask the Caucasian children to stand up, and no child knows what that word is. And then when I ask the Black kids to stand up, somebody will always tell me that what I just said was racist. And then we have to break that down. And I even break it down between my Black students and my African students, because we have a fairly decent Ethiopian population. And we then talk about, these are two different cultures in itself. I then ask my kids who are Latino, like, what is your preference to be called? Because I have children from El Salvador, I have children from Mexico, and their preference is normally to be identified by the country they come from, not to be called Hispanic or Latino. So we want to make sure that they really do have an understanding of what racism means. And then if you can pull up there wasn't a written response on this one. So this is where they did their video entries and their artwork. So that was a great lesson. So again, we've gotten a whole lot of feedback on it. It's been nothing but positive. I think the reasons it was positive is because we were straightforward. We were transparent with these lessons. We tried to anticipate any anxiety parents would have with these lessons and address those beforehand. And we've already decided that these lessons will be part of our teaching next year. And that it's just important that we continue to deliver this message.
Wonderful. I don't know. I don't want to cut you off. Was there more that you wanted to mention? Because I saw a space, but
nope. I think I covered it. But
okay. Okay. Wonderful. I did want to say to those of you listening that I did get the chance to click into each of the books that were presented in Stephanie's lessons, and they're all really amazing. They bring to life, I mean, I'm sure the discussions, I'm sure that many of the parent letters, many of these things bring this all, into clarity. But the books also, if you have a chance to look through these lessons, I would encourage you to look through them deeply, including looking at the books themselves. They're all available either, through, I think, links even within the lesson plans or
Yes.
on, I think YouTube, is it?
Yes.
Great.
We try to make sure that the lessons are complete so that it's easy for anyone just to pick this lesson up and deliver it. And again, with being at home and distance learning, you have to be able to get your hands on the books. And so we try to always keep those links embedded into the lessons.
Wonderful. Thank you. So Christabel, I don't know if you wanted to say anything, but we do want to open it up for questions. So Christabel.
Yeah, I so appreciated this sharing. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Often we work in this sector, and it can sometimes, depending on our roles, be far away from the classroom, which is where the action really happens. So hearing from a true expert in the form of you is something we all can grow from and appreciate. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
All right, so let us open up the floor if there's questions.
Perhaps as people think through their questions, I can just start us off with one. I noticed that you used a mix of texts for your lessons, and sometimes drawing on a fiction text, sometimes a nonfiction text. And given that there's so many books out there in all these genres, what are some of the things you think about when you're selecting texts to use for your lessons?
So when we're dealing with social issues in general, I'm very mindful of the images on the page. I want to make sure that it is representative of a diverse group of people. I also am looking for text that doesn't have too many words on a page if I can, because I think that the meaning can get lost if the text itself does not match the imagery that's being seen. And so I like to find a balance of that rich artwork and less complicated text. I also am looking for things that actually don't diminish the problem. I think there's a lot of books, especially when it comes to children's literature, that it downplays whatever the issue is. And the reality is that kids don't need that. What kids need is answers. What they are looking for is things to be explained to them in a way in which it can be understood. But that doesn't mean you have to water down the message. And so I'm always looking for something that is, especially when it comes to social issues, that is a real accurate truth of whatever it might be. Something happened in our town was a truly painful text to read to kids. And the first time I read it, I cried, knowing that I was going to be the person to deliver this to a bunch of kids. But at the same time, I was so very thankful for that text because I couldn't have delivered the message as well without it. And I think that's, again, one of those things, when we look at issues, we have to go past that discomfort of ours and that need to protect and that need to be afraid to say the wrong thing in a class that is diverse or a class of children who aren't the same skin color of you. I think we have to be able to say, like, this issue is important enough that I can work through those things. It's always an added benefit for me if I can find text that can actually be read to my kids, because that way they can play it back and hear it when I'm not with them, would be the other thing that I've learned when it comes to, especially with social emotional issues, because some kids need their own space to process whatever's being said.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Vanashrik, do you want to ask a question? I see your hand raised.
Yes. Sorry. Hi. Hi. Stephanie, I wanted to first say thank you so much for sharing your very powerful lesson plans. Um, I mean, it has to be incredibly powerful to get children um, it's almost like a call to action, and to have children protest or act on their conviction. It's quite a powerful statement that. But I wanted to ask about the books that you used. I, forgive me if if you've mentioned this before, but I wanted to know when you shared the books with children, did you do it as a group? I know with the whole COVID-19, we're all doing online classrooms, etc. So was this something sort of done in an online group, or was each child asked to read the story on their own?
Thank you. That's a great question. So when in our distance learning, we have live classroom lessons, and our students log in the same day, at the same time every day. And so this was a lesson we did together in which I played the book for them so that they could hear it and see the images, which is again something in which is necessary for kids if you're asking them to face these conversations and these issues. You then have to give them the time to process it with you and to go through that with you and ask those questions. So the first book that we read in any lesson is something we do together. Then the follow-up book, once we've talked about it and we've had our discussions, in the follow-up book is something they do independently that same day. And typically that second book is not nearly as thought-provoking in the sense that it's not going to be a new topic to them, which is why like the first book was talking about letting children march, because they understood the civil rights and they understood the protests back in the 60s. So that wasn't necessarily new information for them, and it wasn't going to necessarily be something troubling to them at that point.
Thank you.
It's the last thing when you're discussing these things with kids, the last thing you want is for them to process any of it in a negative way by themselves. And so when you're having these conversations, you want to make sure that we're all leaving on a good place and the same understanding to the best of your ability, in order for them to then move forward with it.
Absolutely. Especially with the emotive nature of the topics and the themes that you are addressing, you would want to have that facilitated,
yes,
to ensure that there isn't any.
Yes, and the other thing that happened in our conversation about this is I have one Black male student who was very affected by this and started crying in our discussion. And that was something that was, his mom was sitting next to him, and it was very hard for her. But it was also very empowering for him. And when he was able to get back on into the classroom, it was then so wonderful to see all of his classmates being able to support him with this pain. And I feel like that was a big takeaway for a lot of my kids, because going through that and realizing that a kid that you've been friends with and you've probably never thought that there was a difference between you has just shown you how this one issue is so affecting them. And, it was so powerful that, in fact, as we're moving the kids into fourth grade, I've actually requested that my students stay together, which is something I don't normally encourage. But given the two crises that they're dealing with between the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, I feel like the only support they actually have moving forward is each other. And right now that's extremely important for them to have.
I was curious if you have a place you look to for curricula for, I've noticed there seem to be a few places online if you want to continue to kind of expand in looking at the curricula for social issues.
Yes, there are lots of sites out there. NWEA has a lot of information out there. National Geographic has a lot of information out there. What I generally look for is Teaching Tolerance. I just remembered that one is a great resource. But what I generally look at is I look for things in a search engine and then have to scan through to see what I find is matching the ideas that I have for that lesson.
Mm-hmm.
Last year I had 2 students come out as non-gender binary, and there's not a whole lot of lessons for that when it comes to elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
But in putting that into a search engine, I was able to come up with a lot of books that address that particular issue. But as far as finding one specific go-to, it's a lot of hunting.
That's interesting. Does anybody on the phone or on the line now have any sort of other, I guess, resources that you like to use for social topics like this or this topic? Probably needs to require a little bit of time for thinking before asking that question. I'll take it back, but if anything comes up, we'll be curious to know if you have seen other books, because I honestly have seen, in reading many children's books, I find, at least in international work, that they so far haven't really gotten into these really difficult social issues.
And it's hard to find nonfiction texts that's appropriate for elementary school understanding on these issues. So again, there's not a whole lot of lesson plans when you look at it, and then to find something that explains it in a way in which they can understand, those two things are difficult to find. And surprisingly, on issues that have been around for a long time, there's still a lot lacking, like being a foster child or adoption, modern families, so to speak. There's very little that you can find that matches those subjects.
Okay, well, I guess we can probably close here. Christabel, I don't know if you have any final words.
Yeah, like one thought that I had when you were sharing about Snow White, and how Snow White tends to depict one version of Snow White. So one thing just to share as a little side note is that, I work for an organization called Room to Read that does global book publishing. And one of the workshops that we do with authors and illustrators is to have them reimagine fairy tales, for global context, like what, even from the perspective not just of race but also of gender. So I just thought I'd share that as a little side comment. But I just thank you. I'll end with my thanks to you and to all of you who have made time to join the call.
And that sounds fascinating. I hope that one day in the United States, when we're teaching folk tales and fairy tales. I hope one day that that is how it is taught, through the one fairy tale as it's been retold over and over again across the world. Because I think that would just really demonstrate just the diversity and richness of cultures through literature.
Well, thank you again so much, Stephanie, for presenting today. And I know I, for one, will be looking back at these and rereading them. There's so much good teaching here and information to carry forward. So thanks again. And I think, Stephanie, I'm not sure if you would want to send around your information for others in case they, have follow-up questions, but
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I'll do that. I'll send around information about Stephanie in case anybody is interested in following up. And thanks again for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciated the experience, and I look forward to hearing how you guys are all working in your fields and moving forward. I think your work is absolutely fascinating and incredible to me.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.